Hi guys, this is day 20 of the A2 Economics Division Challenge, and today we are doing unemployment. When we look at unemployment from a macroeconomic sense, we're looking at the whole economy. So that's why we need to look at not the demand and supply for a particular industry, but we need to look for demand and supply for the whole economy. And that's why we look at what we call aggregate demand and aggregate supply of labor. And when we look at aggregate supply of labor, that shows us the total amount or the number of people who are workers who are willing and able to accept job at each wage rate. So when we draw our aggregate supply curve, it is a curve that shows us the total supply in the economy of people who are willing and able to accept job at each wage rate. While when we look at aggregate demand curve, it's actually the total demand of workers done by firms. So let's start off by looking at aggregate demand and supply curve in a diagram, and then let's talk about the shape of the demand curve and the supply curve. So when we're drawing the graph for aggregate demand and supply curve, I'm going to write on my y-axis average real wage rate. Now, why is it average? Because we're looking at the whole economy, not a particular sort of profession. That's why I'm finding the average for the whole economy. Number one. Why is it real? Because it accounts for all the inflation that happens. It's not nominal wage rate, but it's actual wage rate, which makes people to decide to accept jobs. On the other hand, on my x-axis, I have quantity of labor. When we draw our aggregate supply curve will be upward sloping but kind of inelastic, and I'm going to talk about this in a little while. Aggregate supply curve is upward sloping and inelastic, while aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and we'll talk about that as well. And where AD and AS meet, we call this equilibrium wage rate, and this would be quantity will be our equilibrium quantity sort of employed in the whole economy. So aggregate demand curve is downward sloping and aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. But when the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, it is inelastic, but it's not perfectly inelastic. And the reason why it's not perfectly inelastic, I'm going to talk about in 1 minute. But the fact that it's inelastic is simply because when you look at the size of the labor force, the size of the labor force does not change that much or significantly due to a change in wage rate. We say this that at any point in time, the given amount of workers in the economy, and even the wage rate goes up, you're not going to see significant changes to happen. But it's not perfectly inelastic. Why? Because it is a possibility that higher wage rate will encourage some people to enter the labor market. So people who decide to sit at home may decide to work when the wage rate goes up, but those numbers are not going to be significant. B, the unemployed will be more willing to accept job offers rather than continuing to search for better jobs. When you are looking at people who are willing and able to work but not working because they are not interested in the kind of work that is available, when the wage rate goes up, we will see more of these people to accept job offers. So aggregate supply curve is inelastic, but it is not perfectly inelastic. On the other hand, the aggregate demand curve is upward sloping, is downward sloping, and we know this simply because when the wage rate goes up, more firms will be trying to sort of hire less workers. Look at this, guys. Aggregate demand curve is downward sloping because higher wage rates will encourage more firms to employ workers, while the lower wage rates will encourage less firms. So as the wage rate goes up, firms may economize, and that's exactly what we wrote here, that the aggregate demand curve for labor is downward sloping, because the higher the wage rate, the more the firms will be attempting to economize on labor. They'll cut down on the number of workers that are being employed. So the market comes at equilibrium where aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve meet, where we get ourselves the equilibrium wage rate. Now, even when the labor market is in equilibrium, one thing we need to understand is that not everyone who is wanting to work or willing to work will be employed. Some people actually stay unemployed because they might be looking for better jobs, they might not be they might not be happy with the current wage rate, and so on and so forth. So we say there is always some people in the economy who are wanting to work but not working right now because they're deciding to stay at home. So I want to go back to our diagram here, and I'm going to show you another curve that we draw. It's called the N curve. The N curve is drawn something like this. It's drawn very close to the AS curve, but the gap between these two curves is increasing at lower wage rate. So this curve called the N curve is drawn, which is slightly closer to AS curve on higher wage rate and is further apart at lower wage rate. And this N curve is basically the curve that shows us the total amount of people who are willing and able to work in a labor market. So N curve shows the total number in the labor force at any point in time who are willing and able to work. So if you see the diagram again, now AS curve is simply the aggregate supply curve, which is people who are actually willing and able to work but are actually working, while N curve are all those people who are willing and able to work and may or may not be working. So the horizontal difference between the N curve and the aggregate supply curve of labor simply represents what we say the excess of people who are looking for work over those who are actually willing to accept jobs. So for example, if I look at this distance here is basically AB, where B is total number of people who are willing and able to work, while QE is total number of people who are willing and able to work but are actually also working. So what is the gap between QT minus QE, QT minus QE, or in other words, the distance AB, the distance, let me write this, distance AB, well, we call this as unemployment that happens on equilibrium. So in other words, it's called equilibrium unemployment. I'm going to talk about this, why this happens in a little while. But this equilibrium employment is basically all those people who are willing and able to work, but are unable to find work for one reason or the other, while all this QE are those people who are willing and able to work and are actually working. So that's why this is called equilibrium unemployment, the gap. But if the wage rate was not at equilibrium, let's say if the wage rate was at higher than equilibrium, let's say for example the wage rate was QW1. Now you need to understand this gap CD is basically the gap between people who are willing and able to work, wanting to work, versus people who are working will only be at point C, because when the wage rate goes up, the employer will cut down on the number of people he will hire, so that will move to C, while because the wage rate is going up, more people will be willing to accept job, and this gap CD is what we call disequilibrium unemployment. So disequilibrium unemployment is happening because the market is not at equilibrium, and that's why it's happening. So from a diagram perspective, we're going to talk about the causes of unemployment, both equilibrium and disequilibrium. Equilibrium unemployment happens at equilibrium. This kind of unemployment is also called the natural rate of unemployment. It happens because of reasons which we're going to talk about in a little while. But disequilibrium happens because the market is not at equilibrium, it's above equilibrium like W1. So let's talk about the causes of unemployment. As can be seen from the diagram, there can be two causes of unemployment. One is what we call disequilibrium unemployment, that happens when the wage rate is above equilibrium, and the other one is basically equilibrium unemployment that happens at the equilibrium. We identify, when you look at disequilibrium unemployment, we identify basically two causes of that. So let me write this. When we look at disequilibrium unemployment, there are two causes, or we can say explanation of disequilibrium unemployment. The first one is what we call real wage or classical unemployment, that is a view of the classical school of thought, and the other one is what we call the Keynesian view, which is demand deficient, or cyclical unemployment. According to the classical economists, the reason why disequilibrium unemployment happens to start off with is because of the fact that there could be what they say forces which are imperfect to start off with. So, therefore, imperfect market forces, for example, trade union, for example, government, they result in wages to rise above equilibrium. For example, if the government decides to increase wages above equilibrium in terms of minimum wages, or trade union demand for higher than equilibrium wages, then something like this will happen. If this is my uh, aggregate demand and aggregate supply of labor, and let's say there is an equilibrium, so let's say this is AD of labor, this is AS of labor, and let's say equilibrium right now happens at WE. There is no unemployment whatsoever as the equilibrium wage is being met. But what if there is a disequilibrium that occurs because of minimum wages, or let's say there is a disequilibrium that happens because of, let's say, trade union asking for higher than the market wages? Then there will be what we call this kind of an unemployment equal to CD, which is what we call disequilibrium unemployment, which happens primarily because the imperfect market forces like trade union and government try to not allow the market to operate freely. According to them, if the market is allowed to operate freely, there will not be any such kind of unemployment that can take place. Keynesian, on the other hand, have a disagreement with this kind of explanation. For them, the disequilibrium and unemployment happens because of cyclical reasons. They say because of cyclical reasons, aggregate demand fluctuates, and that fluctuation in AD can cause basically demand to fall, because labor, according to them, is a derived demand. So, when you're looking at a situation that we did draw earlier, where this is our aggregate demand and supply. Let me draw that first. Now in this case, if the aggregate demand for labor falls, let's say from ADL to ADL dash, because of, let's say, business cycle, economic recession and all that, then ideally the wages should go to this point here and the new equilibrium will be formed. But according to the Keynesians, wages are sticky downward, and if they are sticky downward, then they get stuck at this point WE, which would mean they would not fall to point, let's say, B, but get stuck at point, let's say, C, and therefore the CD becomes what we call our disequilibrium unemployment. Now, why are wages sticky downwards? We've discussed this earlier as well. Wages are sticky downward according to Keynesian because employers do not want to give a wage cut to people, because that becomes a demotivation point. Similarly, employees don't like a wage cut because they feel that they should be paid for the same money for the task that they were performed before. So nobody likes a wage cut, and if nobody likes a wage cut, then there will be unemployment that will take place equal to amount CT. So these are the two what we say reasons of why disequilibrium unemployment take place in an economy. In terms of equilibrium unemployment, when we look at equilibrium unemployment, we are actually identifying three reasons, and that's why equilibrium unemployment is also called natural unemployment, the unemployment that happens at the equilibrium. And we say there are three reasons or three explanations for this. The first one is what we call structural unemployment. The second one is frictional unemployment, and the last one is what we call seasonal unemployment. So what is structural unemployment? Structural unemployment is unemployment that happens because of changes in the structure of the economy. Changes in the structure are basically to do with, for example, when an economy is moving from from agriculture to for example manufacturing, or for example from manufacturing to services, there are a lot of people who will lose job because of lack of skills, and that could result in what this kind of unemployment. Similarly, if there is a loss of comparative advantage, if a country had a comparative advantage and suddenly some other country takes over and get that comparative advantage. Let's say China has gotten a lot of countries to suffer because they got comparative advantage in cheap labor. That can result in basically people to lose job. That will also be structural unemployment. We say structural unemployment has to do with basically loss of skills, and the way we go about solving the problem of structural employment will be basically through what we call providing more skills, retraining, and so on and so forth. When it comes to frictional employment, we say frictional employment happens because people are voluntarily out of work, and they're voluntarily out of work because they're looking for better jobs. So the kind of jobs at equilibrium that are available, either they pay less and that's why they are not attractive, or even if they pay less, the kind of work that they have is not enriching enough, so work is unattractive in terms of the kind of responsibilities and so on. So people are looking for better jobs, and this is kind of like a unemployment that happens because people are looking for work. They're trying to sort of look for the right kind of employer, and that's why we say this kind of unemployment will be more found in countries where there is what we call information gaps or information failure. If employers are unable to find the right employees and employees are unable to find the right employers, yet being in the market will actually be basically due to frictional employment. So frictional employment in short is unemployment that happens because people are still looking for better work. Last is your seasonal unemployment, which happens basically due to the time of the year. Some businesses are seasonal where some people will not be employed, like for example tourism in a very cold area. For example, in up north in Pakistan, there is unemployment that happens because businesses close down, tourism doesn't take place, and therefore people have to find work. Here also we say this, that if people are skillful, they may not be unemployed in off seasons, and therefore this kind of unemployment can also be solved through what we call more skill training. To sum up now, what we say therefore is this, that whenever an economy is saying there is full employment, which is basically a concept that we always talk about, we always want to have full employment. This full employment basically means there will still be some kind of unemployment. So the unemployment at full employment that always exists is roughly 2 to 3%. It's not significant. It's roughly 2 to 3%. And according to economists, this kind of unemployment will happen because of what we call voluntary unemployment, which is mainly because of frictional reasons. Now, one more thing which I want to talk about, just to sum up, is that equilibrium unemployment is also all the voluntary unemployment, while disequilibrium unemployment is what we call involuntary unemployment. It's involuntary because the worker wants to work, but the wages are above equilibrium, and that's why unemployment is happening. So this is involuntary, and equilibrium unemployment is voluntary, despite reasons like, for example, frictional or structural. We say workers can still settle for jobs, but they may not want to work because they may find the work to be unattractive or low paying. Let's now quickly look at what are the costs of unemployment. Well, the first cost of unemployment is the fact that there will be loss of income. When people are losing jobs, incomes will go down. So there will be a fall in income, and that fall of income means lower living standard for a lot of people in the economy. As people will be unable to buy goods and services, and people will be worse off as they will be out of work. So the fact that there will be lower income means there will be lower standard of living. So standard of living will fall. The second implication when it comes to what we call cost of unemployment is that there will be a rise in government spending because unemployment is going up. So unemployment goes up, has to be more unemployment benefits. So that's one thing. At the same time, tax revenue will fall because people are out of jobs, so there will be no income. So as a result of that, tax revenue will fall, and we can look at a situation where T minus G will be less than 0, or there will be what we call more unemployment, more budget deficit that will take place in an economy. Now, what's the implication of budget deficit? Well, first of all, rise in budget deficit means government may have to lend more because they have to pay for these expenditures. Secondly, they might need to cut back or scale back on public spending, such as expenditure on merit and public good. And thirdly, there could also be issues where the government decides to tax more people who are employed. For example, those on jobs may need to pay higher taxes in order to pay for the higher expenditure that happens because now the government has to pay for unemployment benefits, which can have what we call disincentive effect. The third sort of cost of unemployment is economic cost to the economy as a whole. The economic cost is basically the idea that if you look at our PPC, we are no longer on our PPC. In fact, unemployment means we are under the PPC rather than on the PPC, which means the scarce resources in the economy are not properly used. We are below our potential employment level, and that means in the long run, people, if they keep on remaining unemployed, they will be losing skills. So there's a loss of skills which could be permanent, and that permanent loss of skill can also mean our PPC may shift backward on a permanent level because people do not have the same skill level as before. Last one is social cost of unemployment, where unemployment is linked with economic and social deprivation. So unemployment goes up, there will be higher economic and social deprivation. There is a very strong relationship between unemployment and going up and crime going up, or unemployment going up and social dislocation going up. Social dislocation simply means people will be finding increased divorce rates to happen. There will be worsening of health indicators, there will be worsening of life expectancy indicators, so there will be poor sort of health indicators that will also be associated with rising unemployment. So these are the issues why we believe that there is an importance for us to basically fix unemployment and do policies that can lower unemployment in an economy.